Real work gets pushed to the edges, usually early in the morning before people get on Slack, late at night when people go home, and on weekends. The way we describe it is this idea of the infinite workday. You never stop.
We'll be brainstorming about a new feature. Earmark will be gathering that context, immediately push it into Cursor. We'll get a prototype and be able to see it during that meeting.
You can't imagine now not having unlimited task agents running in the background as they converse.
What's really interesting is the new bottleneck is now moved from engineering resources, engineering time, to actually back onto product for review.
Product engineers.
Welcome to the Product Engineers podcast, where I explore the convergence of product and engineering roles in tech. If you've been working in a product team, we all know how it goes. You go through tons of meetings every day, and only when they end is when the real work starts. PRDs, tickets, specs, follow-ups, all the stuff that nobody sees you do. And by the time you're done, the next meeting is already starting. One of today's guests has a name for it, the infinite workday. And that's exactly the problem today's guests set out to fix. Barbir and Sanden Gocka are the founders of Earmark, a tool that turns live meetings into shippable work in real time. We'll get into how they actually use it day to day, where the new bottleneck of product work has moved, and what it looks like when an idea you just said out loud turns into a working prototype before the call ends. I'm walking through it with them, and you can decide if it's worth trying or not. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Mark and Sander. It's great to have you here. I'm very happy to be interviewing you today.
Thanks. Likewise.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Pepe.
So I've been thinking about, what you're doing with Earmark, and everything brings to this problem that product managers have, for example. So they talk about this invisible second shift. And so they spend all day in meetings talking to stakeholders or like to customers and making decisions. But yeah, then the real work actually starts after that, because they need to build all the PRDs and tickets and updates. So could you take me back to a specific day at one of your previous companies where you felt this pain the most, and what happened in those meetings, and what did you do at the end?
Yeah, so Pepe, like for Stan and I, we came from a company called MindBody, which is kind of like large-scaled enterprise SaaS. We had a delivery team of almost 400 people, right? And that was just the engineering group. Like the larger the enterprise scale, the higher the complexity, the higher the meeting volume, right? That also requires a whole slew of artifacts that are created from them. In say any given Friday, for instance, right? We would have portfolio reviews, right? In terms of how our teams are performing. We would have feature kickoffs. We would have retrospectives. We would have incidents that we're managing, postmortems from those incidents that we're managing, right? And this is just any given day, right? Sort of the state of the union of enterprise life. And in that, when you think about just pain, right? This idea of like, okay, we're going to go through all these meetings, and we have to create deliverables from them, but we're going to do this after these meetings. But the issue is that, the next day you're in the same volume of meetings, and the day after that you're in the same volume of meetings. So what ends up happening is real work, right, gets pushed to the ends or the edges, usually early in the morning before people get on Slack, late at night when people go home, and often on weekends. And the condition that the way we describe it is this idea of the infinite workday, right? You never stop. You're just kind of, state of the union is fight or flight, and you're just kind of going from one ceremony to the next, wishing you could execute the work that you have to execute.
Right. So the famous joke about PMs, or like having the calendar full, like they usually are very proud of all the calendar, like with all the
Yeah.
meetings. So it's actually true, right? Cool. So I can imagine there was a moment, maybe a meeting that went kind of sideways. What did you say like to each other afterwards? Because I know you've been working together.
You know,
Sam, you want to take this one?
for me, I was an engineering manager and kind of like slash director at Product Plan, and this was kind of after our gig at MindBody, and really trying to manage kind of the maker slash manager schedule, because I still had a couple teams that I own. I still had one-on-ones that I was doing, but I was also building at the same time, and that was just really struggling. We went through some acquisitions, which also made things a little bit more challenging. what's funny is like, we were kind of working through those motions and we were just like, hey, with everything that we've seen with this AI going on, like it has to like we can't be like just kind of stuck in like kind of like drowning in meetings and like doing all of like this work after work. And like Mark and I, we've always wanted to build something together. So we're like, hey, we've both been in software, we've both been in product for such a long time. Like we feel like we're just constantly trying to play catch up on a day-to-day basis. Like we didn't know what the solve was at that time, but we're like, hey, let's just try something. And then that's what we did.
Nice. So back then, I mean, even before starting to think about Earmark, have you tried like exploring other solutions, like for your own work? What did you try to kind of solve this infinite day that you were suffering from?
Yeah, so solutions back in the day, Pepe were I mean, it's crazy how archaic it was, right? But it would be pen and paper, right?
Okay.
Notepads, analog solutions. And then having that one text edit file, like always on your desktop, that's sort of this running scribe doc, right, that you would leverage. And this is sort of pre-LLMs, right? Where it's like, like where, what are the data points of work, right? So that's like one body of activity. And then like when we were in the enterprise, that's when Zoom started producing AI features, right? Like generic summarization. And we would get emailed or slacked these generic summaries like after these meetings like concluded. But the summaries are really low value, like oftentimes they were kind of tone deaf, to whatever the requirements were of the project, right? The nuance of the project. And oftentimes, since they're very general in terms of use case, because Zoom has to support all teams, right?
Yeah.
Like they really didn't understand like engineering work, right? So like that was suboptimal. So, so you have, analog artifacts to digital. And then the way we would solve it is just trying to will it after hours, right? So this kind of goes back to what I was saying before, where you would try to the only time you could create those artifacts is when there was actual time for deep work or calm, and that was usually when nobody was bugging you, right? And again, that goes back to the time box of, okay, if I'm going to create a great requirements document, right, or some great go-to-market documentation, deep work has to happen in a quiet time. And when is that? It's usually when work isn't happening. That was how we solved it.
I think for me, um, what was really interesting and kind of shared this with Mark is at the time there was a kind of an app that still exists today. It's called Mac Whisper, which does local speech to text. And I would actually I would create just audio recordings of meetings and run it through that process. And that process would take a considerable amount of time, like maybe like 20, 30-ish minutes. And then I remember running it through, I think it was like Claude, like 2.1 at the time. But those pieces just kind of like strung together and then having like bespoke artifacts that come out of that, like that was really valuable. But I'm realizing like, okay, there's a ton of manual work in terms of like, all right, now I have to move the audio files to then transcribe that and then take that and then paste it in and then paste all of the relevant context in there. And that would still take like, an hour just kind of like synthesize all those meetings still after the fact. And I was kind of like, is there something here that can be automated? Um, I think that was kind of like the first glimpse.
Yeah, and kind of related to that, Pepe, like a lot of our customers and prospects that we talk to have these really interesting sort of hacked workflows where they'll take a transcript from, say, a Zoom AI call, and then take that transcript, copy, paste it into their local, and then try to extract all the artifacts of work. So folks are actually
Mhm.
doing activity that's very similar to this, but doing it in a way that's like less than optimal. Like everyone has like this like workflow hack that they're all leveraging, and it seems that like most folks are using transcripts to create all sorts of things afterwards.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's not very user friendly. I can imagine. Cool. So you had this problem and you started to look for a solution. I was reading that actually before Earmark existed, you were building a presentational coaching tool for Apple Vision Pro, right?
Yeah.
And just if you could walk me through, yeah, okay, what the product was, what you learned building it, and maybe most interesting, like the moment you realized you were solving the wrong problem. Yeah.
So this goes back to what Sandon was saying. We just wanted to build something, and for both of us, we've had, startup aspirations over the years, and we've kind of gone through multiple models. I mean, there's quite a few, right? Probably half a dozen. And when the Apple Vision Pro first came out, like we were super excited, right? Like, basically Apple coming up with their interpretation of what a great AR VR experience was going to be. We're both, Apple aficionados, right? We love most of the hardware and the solutions they create. So the opportunity for us was like almost an intersection of like new technology, right? A new wave is coming. We were really passionate about, helping product engineering folks become better communicators, because this is another problem at enterprise scale where you kind of realize like how inefficient we are as communicators often. Or like how not so influential we can be. It's kind of just how we're made as technical people oftentimes. So one of the concepts we worked through was this idea of like a presentation coach, right? Or a communication coach where, with the Apple Vision Pro, you could, improve your skills, your communication skills, specifically for product engineering leaders, by preparing them for rehearsal for, say, any sort of pitch they're doing, or any sort of communication that they have to do, right? So what we would do is we'd actually model like conference rooms, right? Auditoriums. There would be like, Google slide, sort of widget where you could cycle through slides as you're giving presentations. The system would provide real-time feedback as you're going through a presentation rehearsal. It would prompt you to breathe, or speak up, or and it would provide feedback post, your rehearsal. And we went through a lot of, discovery with that solution. It turns out that like people don't really prepare for presentations. So we kind of did this heavyweight lift, created this wonderful solution, right? It was fully realized, in a lot of ways. So, we realized that solution wasn't really going to solve for much, because you think about daily use, right? People aren't, and that's one thing too. If you're preparing for presentations, you're probably not doing it daily as a ritual, right? It probably happens for these high stakes sort of ceremonies. Maybe that happens like once a quarter, right? Maybe once a month. So, the frequency piece wasn't there. And that was a key learning for us, right? And then we pivoted from there.
And I mean, I think also at a certain point, Vision Pro wasn't really also adopted by people. That also was a
Correct.
problem.
It
I remember
was,
in the beginning.
when we started, we didn't know, right? So we actually, like we were very early, with the adoption curve, and we actually spent a lot of time in Cupertino working with pre-release devices. So what we were doing was essentially we wanted to be part of the release wave, right? So the TAM piece, right? The fact that the Apple Vision Pro wasn't compelling from a market perspective wasn't something that we understood until it came out. So yeah.
Yeah. I've seen some videos on the internet, like people actually using it in public spaces, like on trams and things. It was fun to see, like that they're just moving
Yeah,
their hands
yeah.
in the air.
Even going back a little further, Sand and I, are old enough to remember the Google Glass wave, right? And it was the
Yeah.
same sort of phenomenon in the Bay Area where like, these like all of a sudden people are like wearing Google Glass. We go to a conference, everybody's like rocking Google glasses, and there's a term of endearment that we had for them. We called them glass holes. So I don't know what the equivalent is for Vision Pro users, but
So, what was there something you built for the Vision Pro that you ended up bringing into Earmark, or was like a clean start?
You know, it
anyone
was
want to go for it?
Yeah, it was pretty much a clean start. What's really interesting with the Vision Pro solution is that we thought that prepping for meetings, or being able to be prepped for meetings, would actually help kind of with kind of the meeting problem that we had, just being overwhelmed. The elements that we brought in were just kind of the real-time feedback. So completely different, like how Mark was mentioning in the Vision Pro, our real-time feedback was around your pace, your pitch, your volume. Um, but we've been really into real-time feedback for a long time, and that's what we actually brought over to kind of the very first iterations of Earmark, where during the meeting you would almost get these kind of like these little prompts or like suggestions of things that you could say during that meeting, and that's still something that has translated today. I would say that would be kind of the one main thing that has kind of stuck with us this whole time.
What was the thread that connected these two products? Because it's a kind of a big jump, right, from the Vision Pro to software as a service.
As Mark alluded to, yeah, we did a bunch of discovery calls with the Vision Pro, and I forgot who said this, but there was one person who gave us this feedback, which really stuck with us, which was that we're currently building an unproven product which was our startup, on top of an unproven platform. And those two are really difficult to solve. So we almost were like, okay, like how can we take what we know like is a problem, these meetings and this real-time feedback, and translate it to something that is, one, daily, and then two, can be used by anyone anywhere. So that's kind of how we transitioned over to kind of focusing on meetings to start, as well as we just changed the platform completely to like, okay, what does everyone use? Everyone uses the web. Okay, great. Can we build a solution that works both on Mac, on Windows, and also on the phones, and kind of like start broad, and then kind of figure out a way to then kind of dial that in from there. So that was our big turning point for that jump.
Right. Okay, so let's get a bit more practical about Earmark. So you started building it, and now it's actually live and people can use it. Could you kind of walk me through like a real meeting? So maybe you're a PM or an engineering manager, and I am on a call with my team. I'm talking about a feature spec or something like that. What's happening behind the scene? How does Earmark works? And what do I have to do when the call ends? What's out there for me?
Yeah, so I can walk you through a typical case. For one, we love to dog food our own products. We actually use Earmark daily. We think that's also really important. Plus, kind of our mantra is like, if we could solve our own problem, then I think chances are someone else might have that same problem. So one of the ways, that I like to use it is actually during the meeting. I'll have a particular card open. I like to call this kind of the engineering translator, where if I'm talking to someone that's really technical and maybe they say something that's kind of over my head, what it does for me is it essentially just kind of retranslates what was said into kind of language that I understand. And what's nice about that is, especially when I was kind of running these teams, maybe I'll have to like kind of like interrupt the flow or like ask a clarifying question, is that this would allow me to kind of keep on par or keep on pace with the conversation without having to interrupt or without feeling imposter syndrome. So that's kind of an example of using that live. And then using it kind of after the fact. So say meeting ends, we still do have kind of like your basic meeting summary that will output from that. But going beyond that in terms of actually getting work done is we have these templates that can generate just kind of like engineering specs for you. So essentially, okay, I've talked about a couple different engineering items in this meeting. So pull out those engineering tickets and then push those directly into Cursor, or push them into Linear so I can get them into my issue backlog. And if I take it one step further, like my favorite use case is actually doing that step that I just mentioned after the meeting, but actually doing it in the meeting. So we'll be brainstorming about a new feature. Earmark will be gathering that context, and we'll immediately push it into Cursor. We'll get a prototype and be able to see it during that meeting, which is really cool because then we can riff on it from there. Previously, that would have been like, okay, let's follow up. Let's go into another meeting. This just allows us to get so much more done, like in a meeting. Mark, I'll let you highlight any use case that you want to.
Yeah. Well, Pepe, I think a lot of what we see is just like almost like behavioral change, where one of the core tenets of Earmark is being able to have unlimited task agents running like as conversations progress. So one way to think about it is like, so you have your PRD generator, your feature spec generator, your linear ticket generator taking place, updating in real time. But I can have as many agents as I want. And for our users, what's really interesting is they can't imagine now not having unlimited task agents running in the background as they converse. Right. So that's really sort of like the big unlock, right? It's like I can just sort of delegate this whole part of my brain, right? Have confidence that the system will make sure nothing falls through the cracks. Give me an artifact that has level quality that isn't heavyweight. But like the idea, to Sandon's point, is cycle time, right? Like if I can execute that work in a 30-minute increment or an hour increment, that's a lot better than, do the hour, right? And then after my meeting workday is over, create those artifacts after the fact. Like we want to make sure the cycle time is like right there, if that's if possible.
So when Sanden, you said about translating, like this is very interesting. So, for example, let's say I'm a PM, I'm not very technical. So does it mean that while the engineer is talking about all this technical stuff, Earmark can help me understand what the person is saying, something like that. How does it work,
Yeah.
this translation in practice?
Yes, that is exactly correct. So maybe there's like an engineering term or phrase that is used during that meeting, and what's really nice is just kind of almost seeing it in a representation of a card and seeing it stream in, and it basically just almost defines what that is. Of just defining it, I think where it really shines is, okay, since we know about your context, not only can we define what it is, but like this is how it's related to what was discussed. And what I found is like that enables kind of PMs or even myself when talking to folks, especially if there's not something that I understand, to be able to contribute to the conversation. And in a likewise use case, by the way, we do have one template that's kind of make me look smart, and almost like maybe I'm more passive or reserved in the conversation and I need help kind of joining in. And so this one kind of gives me some questions, maybe probing questions that I can ask kind of related to that questions. And this has kind of helped some people who might have that imposter syndrome, who are relatively shy speaking up, myself, just to kind of get out there. And we've had some good feedback around that one.
Right? Yeah, as an engineer myself, I think something that would be cool is like if I could maybe see more about the context behind what like the product manager is talking about, maybe like a
Yeah.
customer decision or something like that. Is that possible? Can you kind of connect external sources so that the information can be fetched from those sources?
Yeah, that is actually something that we are working on currently. Almost like connecting your Slack channel, say if you had
Okay.
your feedback or Dovetail or whichever tool that you're using, to be able to understand, like, hey, like we're brainstorming this problem, is this really a problem? Like as you're talking, can it pull in a bunch of customer quotes from this? So almost you can validate it right there. Or does it be like, okay, no one has mentioned this. This is like brand new idea. So that kind of goes back to that real timeness during your meetings. And without that, that's something kind of to what Mark's point is, okay, someone has to actually do that work. Someone has to do that research, whether that's an agent or whether that's a human doing that. That's still going to take place after the meeting, and that's still going to require a follow-up. But if that could be done within that cycle time, that could just help teams roll a lot faster.
Yeah.
Well, there's one exception where if let's say those customer calls took place within Earmark, that conversational context is in the system. So one thing that's really cool about the system is I can actually go back to any conversation and get instant recall, or search any transcript and get instant recall. So if I needed like a great customer quote, from last Tuesday, I just wish I knew what this person said. You're able to like fetch those things just in time, just in need within the system today.
Oh, sounds very cool. So, Mark, you were talking about the fact that we're saying during a meeting can already go to cursor or linear. Have you find any difference between going directly to cursor from earmark to cursor directly and building the prototype, or going first to linear and then building something from there in terms of quality of outcomes or usefulness? Have you seen any difference there?
It's a great question, Pepe. I think a lot of it just kind of comes down to like how the squad that you're in consumes work, right? So linear as a proxy would be, if I have planning, right, at some point I need to delegate these things, and the cycle time might be a little more protracted, right? Where it's like we have rituals, we have a 2 week sprint cadence, right? We need linear tickets in place in preparation for 2 week sprints because we need to refine a backlog. Like that's a body of activity, right? But to Sandon's point earlier, like if I want to see it right away, do it live, and push the cursor immediately, and then refine a prototype, verbally. I think to us like that's really the magic moment, and I think really the future of work where instead of there being sort of this interstitial stage, right? Or there's going to be less of interstitial planning, I think, and more sort of immediacy in terms of artifact. I think the other thing, and this kind of goes back to our thesis around a context degradation, where the longer you wait, sometimes the worse the outcome could be. I think the higher quality outcome will be like immediate, But that said, if you want to make a production ready app, right, it's going to require a few hands and participants, and you're going to have real rigor around these things, and they're not going to be prototypical builds, right? And that's kind of like where the linear sort of path makes more sense.
There's one path that's emerging that is really exciting. So we recently released a feature where we actually will save your transcripts locally to your machine. And what this allows you to do is use any local agent of your choice. So we have people who are using Cloud Cowork. I'm using Codex myself. And what really enables you to do is I could be in Codex, maybe working on a feature, and I'm like, okay, like I would love to be able to, well, like I know that we talked about like this modal that we want to add, but I forgot what it is. So I just like be like, hey, like look into my meetings folder, and Codex alone can just kind of run through an agent, go through and iterate through all of those different transcripts, pull out all the information it needs to like fully flesh out that body of work while I'm working on it. Other folks who are using Cowork use it to kind of pull together like either their emails or their meetings to be able to send out status reports or whatnot to their internally or to their own clients. So that unlock of using kind of a local agent with Earmark is that's been huge so far.
Yeah, and we're the only voice AI solution that does that, like saves out to like local markdown in order for local agents to consume.
Cool. So I can imagine someone that is listening to the podcast maybe thinking, so we have now this real-time AI that is maybe producing all the tickets and the PRDs, or all the things that we're going to write manually after the meetings, which sounds absolutely great also for the cycle time, as you were mentioning. What happens if it happens? Then you can let me understand this, when Earmark kind of misunderstands the intent that people have during the meeting, and how often that can happen, and what guardrails have you put in place there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the safeguards that we have is human in the loop. Um, it's always been just I think maybe something philosophically that we believe in that Earmark should not complete the work for you end to end. And that might kind of sound a little bit weird, but we think of Earmark as more of augmenting you as a human versus straight on replacing the work that you do. And what I mean by that is, say, like we generate these artifacts, there's still kind of like an approval stopgap, or like, hey, here's this email, or here's like the Slack update, or here's whatever the artifact is. Take a look at it, review it. If this looks good, you can approve it, and then it kind of will continue to send on its way. That's important because one, we want to make sure that what's introduced is still high quality. Like it still has to have the human touch. And like my worst fears is introducing AI slop into any of your tools. Like you don't want to have like a bunch of tickets that are nonsense and that gets put into linear. I almost, how dare I can conflate linear and Jira right there. But yeah, you don't want to have that in your tools. Plus, since you were the one using that, and since it's going out probably like in your name, that's also going to make the user look bad. So that's not something that we ever want to do. So having that human in the loop as kind of that stopgap is what we have. We have done a lot of work around our evals that are the hallucination rate that we've seen and you can hear from our customers is actually quite low. The more context that it has to work with, the better the results have been.
But I can also imagine that. So let's say an engineering manager or PM is going to use Earmark, and what Earmark is doing, for what I'm understanding, is helping also translating everything that we're saying during the meeting to something actually actionable that cursor or maybe another developer can work on. But I think a lot of, for example, PMs could think like that's exactly my job. I have to translate stuff, right? I have that's been my work all along. What would you say to them?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Pepe,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
you're right. I think there's a profile of, PM or engineering manager who they kind of look at their skill set as like, I'm a fantastic scribe, right? I can generate documents like nobody else's business. I'm the best at it, and a lot of their self-identity kind of comes with those things, but I think, I mean, this is our bias, right? That driving outcomes, driving strategy, vision casting, right? Talking to customers often versus being an internal facilitator is really where I think the work of product needs to be. And I think with AI, for these roles where they're very much generalists, and they're communicating with executives, they're communicating laterally with their peers, they're communicating to their individual contributors, right? And then different levels of fidelity in every channel. For those folks that just need more capacity to be more customer facing, to be more strategic, right? Like for us, that's really like what we're giving them. And that's what we hear from our customers all the time. It's just like, I mean, for a lot of our customers that are working 60 plus hours a week, that's just state of the union. That's just product as a discipline. So, so they're already overtaxed, right? And oftentimes they haven't talked to customers in months because they're more beholden to internal teams and internal needs than customer needs, right? And I think for that profile, that's really where our sweet spot is.
You can say for engineers, there's a whole variety of different tools built like Cursor, Codex, Cloud Code that enable them to move 10x, if not more, faster. But there really hasn't been a solve for PMs, and that's what we're trying to solve with Earmark. Is it's not replacing the PMs, but giving them that same superpower, that same augmentation that engineers have had, but for the PM role.
Yeah, I think YC was calling for a cursor for product managers, right? So, but
Yes.
Earmark
They
we won.
did, yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny. When we applied probably like a year ago, that was actually our tagline for our YC app was a cursor for product managers. So you heard the band first, Pepe.
Okay. So, this podcast is about product engineers, right? So, the convergence of product engineering. And the problem you're solving with Earmark, I think it really sits at the intersection of the two roles. From your experience leading both product and engineering teams, why do you think that this gap has been so hard to close?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, especially what's happening right now with the AI accelerating the engineering, is that what that's enabled engineering to do is work so much faster that you can just kind of comb through your bottleneck just kind of like in a day. And what's really interesting is the new bottleneck is now moved from engineering resources, engineering time, to actually back onto product for review. So it's almost like just because you can build all of these things doesn't necessarily mean that you should. Like, should we release all these features? Like, they might sound good in theory, but does that actually make our product a lot more complex and like a lot more bloat? And if you have an engineering team of multiple people, having that PM like kind of sitting there and reviewing is almost kind of like the bottleneck to the engineers just pushing stuff out. So that right now that gap is, how can we arm the PM to, one, really understand what's happening technically, but then two, being able to move quickly within those meetings to shorten that cycle time, to really keep up with that throughput from the engineers, to almost flip that so that that role can become more of a proactive role than a reactive role, which has been a reactive for probably since it was created.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Pepe, for like product engineers, as a profile, when you think of folks that are becoming more generalists, now with the advent of AI, if you have to own, say, the experience, right, the quality quotient, in addition to the actual like feature delivery, oftentimes, I think product engineers are typically more customer facing than most engineers, right? Because there's a natural curiosity there, a sensibility there, right, that makes product engineers a little bit more like PMs in terms of customer centricity. And I think for that profile, like Earmark excels, right? Because if you're in a conversation with the customer, right, to Sandon's point, if I wanted to synthesize a set of deliverables or a prototype from them, right, it's just as valuable to a product engineer in the same way that it's probably valuable to, profiles like say forward deployed engineers. If I'm on site all the time and my customers are barraging me with all sorts of requirements or asks, who's my proxy, right? Like what's the triage? How do I synthesize these things in short form? I'm just trying to build, right? And I think for those profiles, Earmark does a really good job with.
Yeah. This makes me think about a story a friend of mine shared recently. So he has a startup, and he said that his co-founder was in this conference, and he was talking with some like a prospect client, and this client, this person said, "Yeah, we need this feature that is missing." Right, so he just called back the co-founder, and they explain everything that needs to be done, and they did everything like in 3-4 hours, and they could show the same feature at the same conference the same day. So yeah, I imagine something like Earmark can really help speed up this process of gathering information and showing something immediately.
Yeah, because the inception for most of these concepts is conversation, right? Like, and that's really like I think why you think about where we could have started. We could have started with customer insights and ingesting those from, a CRM, or we could have started with Slack threads and ingesting those, and coming up with insights. But I think the freshest context and the most relevant context will always be voice, always.
Mhm. Do you think Earmark would eventually also work in the background? Let's say I can imagine data has been always been captured through product analytics and support tickets and Slack conversations. So I can imagine Earmark could be still there hearing about all these facts and producing something to show to the product team. Do you think this is a direction it would take?
Yeah, what's really interesting about Earmark is that meetings is just one source of data input. And kind of Mark was saying, like, we wanted to start with meetings because that's where 90+% of the communication happens. But there's still a lot of valuable information that does occur in your Slack, that does occur maybe in non-meetings, like in passing, or that does occur in like your emails or your documents or whatever. So either being able to pull that information into Earmark, or kind of like the other flow I was mentioning, where you can use kind of a local agent to use Earmark as a source along with the other source. Both of those, even though opposite, are kind of valid flows. And I think taking that next step where we can have that more like holistic sense of your context is something that we're looking at exploring. But now we're really focusing on the meeting bit, because what we've noticed is that our customers are really loving the solution and how it kind of helps them navigate their day, that's actually turned into a behavioral change, which just turned into a habit. So almost like using that habit as kind of like the first step. It's like, great, here are your meetings, we're aggregating it, you're using it. And then now, like, what is kind of like the next valuable data stream that we can add to that? That's what we're looking at. Yeah.
There's one thing I wanted to ask you. So you said that you are dog fooding your own product, so you're using it to build your market itself. So, and it's funny that you came from this experience where you were managing hundreds of developers, and now it's just you two building Earmark. So, how does your day looks like now that you have actually no end off? So, how do things change from the past?
It's so different. It's so nice, So, the contrast of every meeting being different contextually every 30 minutes throughout the day with different audiences and different artifacts. That's not our use case. That's actually where the tool shines, like is the more complexity, the better. But for us, in terms of day in, day out, like we still have customer calls every day, right? We still have prospect calls every day. We try to limit our meetings because we love deep work, because we want to really embrace, the startup experience, because we could actually, like, obviously we have to get a lot of deep work done. And one example is, we have like a really large ceremony each week where we kind of go through sales and engineering. It might be like a 2 hour or 3 hour sync, and we kind of just get a lot of topics out of the way. But what's wild from that meeting is we'll derive things like, we'll have like, say 3 customer calls. We'll talk about it in terms of prospects. We'll talk about the language that people use to describe the solution back to us. We'll kind of brainstorm maybe social content ideas, or we'll brainstorm go to market or support ideas or support documentation. And, when by the time the meeting's done, we almost get a game where like every deliverable that we could create, we try to create like during that meeting. So oftentimes, like it'll be new landing pages as an example in terms of experiments, right? With like revised language, or different cold outreach drips, right? Because we're talking through ways to maybe talk about the product a little bit differently, or support, like I mentioned, right? In terms of our Mentlify site, right? And having just docs taken from that conversation context and made into a Mentlify page as an example, right?
Yeah, when we're meeting in that sync, I can see Mark typing away into Earmark on the other end of the call. Because as we're talking through kind of the customers, be like, oh yeah, we should follow up with this customer on X, or oh, we just released this feature. We think this customer would really like that. Like we should hit them up. Mark will be typing into Earmark about like, okay, like we should, talk to, mention this customer, and then we'll actually kind of come up with the first pass of either the Slack message or email for that customer. So what's really cool about that is he's actually sending those things out during the meeting. Otherwise, that would just be like, okay, here's like a task list, like this agenda that I'll do after the meeting. So like that's been great. But I'll say my favorite case is whenever we have to fill out like a document or a form, whatever it is. Well, actually, we'll just take that, we'll just upload it to Earmark, and as we're actually in the meeting, we'll just talk through it. And with the real-time aspect, we'll actually see a representation of that form start to fill in, and as like in real time. And what's really cool about that is that it actually, by seeing it in real time, it shows us where we'll just kind of talk through that, have it fill in, and when we're done, great. We'll do a proof pass, and then we can send it out. But it's just like it's just so much easier. Just kind of just talk through stuff, and then get it done before the meeting ends.
Yeah, we had this case study with one of our providers, Assembly AI, and they gave us like this like case study document, and literally like we just copy paste it, tell our Mark like please see this document as the conversation progresses, and 20 minutes later we have like this awesome case study just self-authored with like pull quotes incorporated, right? Like perfectly formatted, and we copy paste it, we send it back, and like it's just like those again those work cycles, right? Like if in our old lives, if I was given a case study document from somebody who I'm co-marketing with, that's a big lift, right? I'm gonna spend a lot of time
Yeah.
on it. I want to do a good job, right? And then if it's actually better as a result of having three people in a conversation, leveraging that context, and then synthesizing an artifact. It's wild.
From the smile on your face, I can see you're having a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is, yeah.
So, before wrapping up the episode, I'd like to ask you one last question. So, let's say there is a PM or an engineer or an engineer manager listening to this right now, and they are just so tired about all the meetings and all the work they have to do. So, what's the one thing that you would recommend to them? Like, if they want, like, for example, start working with Earmark, what's the first step towards simplifying their lives?
Yeah, just go to www.tryyourmark.com, download the app, and press start capture and task. I think, maybe the pro tip for them is almost a little different, where I think for folks who haven't explored voice AI solutions, or haven't explored things that are beyond general summaries, or haven't explored things beyond AI notes, right? Like note takers are a big category that have gotten really popular in recent years. I think it's really important for folks to understand that, like, if a deliverable is only as good as, let's say, like, if it only serves me, is a great example, right? AI notes is for me, right? Its utility begins and ends with me, right? I still have to do the synthesis after. Until people experience it, it's hard to explain what that value is. Like just an initial synthesis versus actually getting something out of it, or an actual output or an outcome. That's the real unlock, right? And that's something we encourage everybody to try, because the future work is wild, right? It is not like the analog example, right? It is not like my text edit file. It's like you don't have to do those things anymore.
Yeah, and
Sam, is there
definitely
anything you'd add?
definitely reach out to us through our website. We love to get on a call. One of the things that we love to work with is we love to understand what your problem is, and actually help create tailored kind of bespoke ways of using Earmark. And we can help you essentially create these templates and just make sure that you're really, really successful in this solution.
I'll make sure to add all the links into the description so people can find you. All right. Yeah. Thank you very much, guys, for joining me today in the podcast. It was very interesting to hear about Earmark and the problem you're trying to solve. And yeah, I think it's going to have a lot of a good impact on how we build products. Thanks again.
Thank you, Pepe.
Thanks, Pepe. We really appreciate the time.